Welcome to Conveyancing Matters, and on this chat, Stu and I are talking to Colin McWilliams. Welcome to Conveyancing Matters with Lorraine and Stu. Join us for a chat about all things property.
So, hi guys,
Morning,
welcome
everyone.
to another episode of Conveyancing Matters. We've got a great special guest, but before we introduce him, how are you, Lorraine?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks, Stu. I'm good. I can't believe I'm sounding like my nan, that it's halfway through January already. And it's still cold. But hopefully Colin is going to warm the cockles of conveyancers' hearts. That's what I'm hoping with such a great guest. So hello, Colin, how are you?
I'm well. How are you doing?
Yeah, good, thank you. So, Colin, for the three people watching this who don't know who you are, because I'm assuming that most do, because you've got a fairly heavy presence on social media, just tell us just a little bit about yourself, a thumbnail about yourself, and then we'll get into the reason you're here.
Yeah, and for the benefit of anybody who may have forgotten, because I took a short sort of few months productivity break from LinkedIn, so I may well have been forgotten during that time. But I'm a conveyancing solicitor. I'm the deputy chair of the Property Lawyers Alliance, and yes, I occasionally post somewhat entertaining things on social media, so I'm told.
Yeah, exactly. So, Colin, Property Lawyers Alliance started off, I think, if memory serves, as the Property Law Action Group. You're the deputy of the Property Lawyers Alliance as rebranded. So, tell us a little bit about the alliance first and what it is and how property lawyers might join, and then we'll perhaps get into a discussion about, why it came about, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So the Property Lawyers Alliance, as it exists now, is essentially well, it serves two purposes. One, it's a community for property lawyers, conveyancers generally, and to use more or less however they wish. It's a members group. So all of our members, if you like, are part of the group and have a say in its direction and so forth. So it's a community to use however they like. And also there's the sort of more political arm, which is sort of the throwback to our origins, which is sort of taking a more active sort of role in sort of directing conveyancing and in the direction which we want to direct it. And obviously members have a say in that direction as well. But you don't have to be politically minded to be involved in it. You can just use it as a community if you wanted to.
Is there a fee for joining?
Yes, it's £50 per annum. We try to keep it as low as we can. Yeah, £50 per annum is the fee.
Excellent, thank you. So what do members get for their £50, Colin?
Well, it's kind of a question of what you want to get out of what you want to get out of it, because it depends how much of an active role you want to play. If you just want to use it as a community, then we have a forum, a website, and you can interact with your fellow members as much as you like. The forum is probably the main selling point for people who want to sort of not be involved in the political side, because we use that as sort of a can I run this past you type of facility, which I think is invaluable. We have some really experienced, knowledgeable people there. Um, they can really help if you get stuck, which obviously happens to all of us. Regardless of how much experience you have, there's going to be something that you've not seen before, or you're not sure about, or you may just want to sense check with a fellow experienced colleague. So that's probably the major selling point. People who aren't really interested in the political side.
I think
Brilliant. So, if,
that's
any, if anyone's looking to join, then can I assume it's just a case of going onto the website, becoming a member, paying your fee, and you're all on board?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can either visit the website, which is propertylawyersalliance.co.uk, or they can email me, Colin at propertylawyersalliance.co.uk, and we can discuss what you want out of your membership.
I think that that's a really interesting point because, of course, more and more, I mean, you said yourself, Colin, you're a consultant. I mean, when I was in practice, particularly, frankly, when I was less experienced, but even when you are, actually the ability to sort of wander down the corridor and ask a colleague about something at the end of the day is really invaluable. But we've now got more and more property lawyers becoming consultants and sort of maybe, working at home or working in a different environment. And that that is then missing that ability to just sound off with a colleague and say, oh, what do you think about this? So that forum, and as you say, I think a particular strength, I have to say, for the Lawyers Alliance is the quality of some of the people that you've got involved, in terms of their knowledge and experience. Because obviously, Stephen, let's have a brief talk about Stephen, because Stephen Larkham is very, I think probably the sort of original founder, if you like, if memory serves, Colin, and he's just very, very experienced and really knows his onions. He's a very, very good technical lawyer as well, isn't he?
Yeah, so Stephen Larkham is the chair. A few of us were founding members, but he sort of very much gets the credit for sort of organizing us and putting us in some sort of useful format. And yes, you're quite right. He's a fountain of knowledge. I'm
Yeah.
sure he won't mind me saying, and he's a good sort of parallel to myself, who I'm sure he won't mind me saying is a little bit younger, and has a sort of different perspective on things. Not entirely. There's plenty that we agree on. I think we agree on most things. But we've got an interesting sort of dynamic between the two of us where we sort of have a good sort of overview of knowledge and sort of perspectives on things in general.
Well, Stu, actually, I mean, I think, Colin, you won't mind Stu and I saying, I mean, Stu, just off air, well, I have to say, two oldies like us, Colin, we did mention the old age thing, didn't we, Stu? Didn't we, Stu?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's that I think going back to the people that are involved in this day and age, the conveyancing has become so complex now that it's inconceivable that everybody can know everything. So having different people there that you can lean on is a really good tool. And for 50 quid a year, that's great value, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, even if you're confident that you know absolutely everything about the law, it might be even as simple as, does somebody know who I need to email to do this? Or does someone have an email address for
Yeah.
such and such bank, building society, or whatever? Has anybody come across this before? I've had one recently where I've not had a help to buy redemption in absolutely years, so forgotten how to do them. If you've forgotten how to do them, it's a complete mystery unless you've just got someone a lot of our members are also my friends because I'm very actively involved in the group. So I can just pick up the phones to some of these people and say, I know you deal with this very often. Can you just give me the Reader's Digest version of how I do this rather than reading this 20-page PDF? So it's for me at least, it's invaluable. And as I say, even if you're confident that you know your stuff, there's no shame, I think, in just getting a second opinion. Because we can't be experts in everything.
Yeah, of course. So, Colin, if we were to so I suppose go back to the start, why did you start the whole thing?
Yeah, well, originally, I think that the way I would describe it was almost like an immune response to a sort of a number of I don't know if attacks might be a bit dramatic, but a number of problems, let's say, with what was happening at the time. I mean, if you don't know much, if you only know about our sort of our challenges to the Law Society, you might be forgiven for thinking that we were mostly concerned with material information, but actually that was just one of many things that was sort of on our radar when we formed. I think the main thing was actually Axiom Ints that really gave us the impetus to sort of band together. But material information just sort of ran away with at some points and took up all of our time. So it was a number of things. And we originally had a sort of series of goals that we wanted to sort of turn our attention to as a group. And that just sort of got thrown along the wayside when material information came along. But Axiom Ints was the big one. Very, very concerned about the way that the profession is regulated and various things that all sort of flow from that, but also obviously material information being a big one. The Law Society, frankly, not doing its job, in my view at least not as well as it should be. And I won't go on for too long, but those are some of the things that we sort of gave us the impetus to form. And now, since we've sort of rebranded, we've focused more on sort of supporting the profession in addition to our sort of more political activities.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important point, isn't it, Colin? Because, we said off air about our, probably yours and definitely mine's, and to a lesser extent, perhaps Stu, but our tendency to just sort of rant. And I think the thing is, if you if you aren't careful, not you personally, but sort of one generally, if you use social media to sort of vent your spleen and to get your view across, and you do that very well, there is a risk that you just come across as being a bit of a ranter without actually offering ideas, thoughts, solutions, ways forward. And actually, those things are really incredibly important. You have to sort of be able to put your money where your mouth is, in a way. Offer solutions. It's very easy. I mean, Stu and I say this a lot, don't we, Stu? It's really easy to criticize stuff. It's very much harder to actually come up with potential solutions, isn't it, Stu?
Absolutely. It's incredibly difficult, and having the time to do so. Exactly as you've said, everyone's got an opinion, haven't they? But, coming up with solutions and practical ways of which things can be dealt with is different.
So what, I mean, again, for perhaps the benefit, for example, of maybe people watching this who aren't SRA regulated, Colin, just give a thumbnail about the Axia Mints, and I do call it debacle, undoubtedly. So as I say, for the few people watching who don't know what we're talking about when we just mentioned Axia Mints, what is it that inspired you all to act?
Well, I'm certainly not an expert on this, so I'll be mindful of not overstepping my sort of remit here. But essentially, I think the views of many was that it could have been handled better by certain bodies and entities in the profession, let's say. And now, obviously, we have a report that sort of has exonerated that view. I think a lot of people thought that it was unfair that solicitors who generally had done nothing wrong were having to pay for the misconduct, criminal acts of certain people in their profession that could have perhaps been prevented. So I think from a sort of moral perspective, that really got people's backs up. That some people perceived that there was failure in oversight by certain bodies, and that the profession as a general in general were being penalised financially as a result of those failures, even though we, had nothing to do with it. I think that was it in a nutshell. But, more generally, obviously, someone in the profession got away with a great deal of client money. And we've all had to sort of, chip dive deep in our pockets to sort of bail out the profession as a consequence of a few bad actors. It didn't sit right with many of us.
Oh no, I agree. I mean, I teach solicitors accounts, and I rant about it all the time. I find it really hard, actually, Colin, to say to students or people coming into the law, oh well, you've got to be really careful because a small number of accounts rules transgressions means that your COFA might have to report you, and which is right, by the way, and yet. Axia Mints, 64 million pounds went missing from client account on the SRA's watch, which the Legal Services Board has now criticised. But I think the thing, and I did post about this actually, Colin, because me paying my personal £90 contribution to the compensation fund absolutely stuck in my craw at the end of last October. The 2,000, what was it, £250, something like that per firm, whether you were a sole practitioner on a high street or a city giant, also stuck in many's craw. But I think actually something that occurred to me is the timing of the Legal Services Board report criticising the SRA, because they brought that out around the end of October. And of course, I think, and I questioned, and I thought, gosh, why did that report come out so late? And of course, I think, and I could be wrong, but it just seemed to me to be no coincidence that was right at the very end of the practicing certificate renewal period. When had it come out 2 or 3 months before, I think a whole raft of the profession would actually potentially have said, no, we're not going to pay this levy based on the report. So it just struck me as being very cynical timing that we pretty much probably all paid our practicing certificate renewal and by the time that LSB report came out. And of course, I also concerns me, Colin, that once the professions put our hand in our pocket for this sort of thing, we're going to be asked again, aren't we? If it happens again.
Yeah, well, your tinfoil hat is showing, Lorraine, but I think you're quite right, or I can understand your perspective. I mean, that report was postponed. How long were we waiting for that report? Seemed like
think
forever.
Last spring.
And it was being postponed. Well, I was about to say without explanation, but they were saying it had something to do with the election at one point, didn't they? Which
Yes.
seemed completely ridiculous to anybody with a brain. And then we found out the reason. Well, perhaps the reason why it was postponed because it was rather scathing of the SRA. But there you go.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So Stu, talk to Colin about some of the more controversial things we were talking about off air.
Well, I suppose material information is obviously one of the big topics that you've spoken about. And of course, this has caused, I suppose, would you say loggerheads with certain others involved in the profession? And I think Lorraine and I have both discussed material information probably numerous times before. And I think Lorraine and I have a similar view that in theory, a proportion of it is a good idea, but also that it potentially is not the silver bullet that maybe everybody thinks it is. So maybe you could just give us a sort of brief rundown on your views regarding material information and how that's potentially caused a bit of controversy.
Yeah, absolutely. So material information, as I mentioned before, was on our radar pretty much ever since. It was well, it's actually sort of I credit it with sort of radicalizing me, for want of a better word, to start off with, because certain people in the profession were singing its praises, and I could not understand their logic at all. And I was having conversations with certain people, and their arguments just did not stand up to scrutiny in my mind. Didn't make any sense to me. So I thought, I think there's some exaggeration, there's some gaslighting, there's some whatever you want to call it of the profession to make us believe that this is a good idea. And if you don't embrace it both barrels with two hands, that you're going to be left behind. This is going to be a runaway train. You're on it or you're off it. And you're going to miss out your opportunity on your opportunity unless you fully embrace it. So material information for anybody that doesn't know sort of it. It was originally stems from the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading Regulations, but then we had a big change when it came to the guidance issued by National Trading Standards Estates and Lettings, and then they somehow convinced the Law Society to update the dreaded property information form, the dreaded fifth edition, to reflect that, which made absolutely no sense in my view, and everybody almost universally hated the fifth edition, regardless of whether or not they were in favor of material information generally or not. I was sat in a lot of these webinars hosted by the Law Society, and the two that I attended, nobody was in favor of the fifth edition, and some of them held their hands up and say, "I am a full-on believer in material information. However, the fifth edition is terrible." I wish those people would just see that actually this is the logical conclusion of material information, is that conveyancers are going to have to do more work. Conveyancers are not going to get paid fairly for doing this work. And this is one of the arguments that didn't make sense to me at all, because people were saying, well, if you just help estate agents with complying with their requirements, they're obviously going to instruct you to act on the sale. And I said, well, that's great, but if that's the case, then my competitor's going to do the same. We both end up working for nothing. So a lot of these arguments just didn't make any sense to me, and it wasn't for a want of trying, well, it wasn't for a lack of trying to find a compromise. But it didn't make any sense to me, and that's what sort of started things off. And then the more we dug into it, the more we realized there were glaring holes with this. A lot of the people behind it knew nothing about conveyancing, weren't conveyancers, didn't have the best interests of conveyancers in mind, and the whole thing just was poorly thought through, and should have never happened. But we conveyancers collectively, we have to hold our hands up and say we were late to challenging this. This was on the horizon for a very long time. We should have paid attention to it sooner and stopped it much earlier, because the whole thing was just poorly conceived from the get-go.
I mean, it's interesting, Colin, isn't it? Because, and obviously, to be fair to you, it was, well, the PLAG, as I think it was then, that obviously sort of pushed the Law Society sufficiently that you had the vote of no confidence, which, of course, to be fair, the Law Society won, but or defeated. But at the end of the day, I agree with the analysis that were it not for that, they probably wouldn't have had their consultation over autumn on the PIV. But I think the idea actually, and this is what interests me about what you're doing, is conveyancers are late to the party for lots of things or are not involved. I mean, we could, the Building Safety Act would be another classic example. Another one on the horizon, invariably, and we've talked about this, Stu, haven't we? In fact, very recently, the changes to leasehold. We get, government ministers talking about leasehold, and that's supposed to be the basis of an adult conversation about this. But the property lawyers who are going to be having to implement this stuff, whose indemnity insurance is going to be on the line, they are never involved in these discussions, and that really gets on my nerves. So are you, Stephen, anybody else in the Property Lawyers Alliance, Colin, sort of trying to contribute to committees? What are you doing in that regard?
Yeah, well, we certainly try our best. We have to accept the fact that we are a reasonably small group with very modest means, and we are all well, at least all of us who are in the political arm of the group, we are all practicing conveyancers. So we've all got a day job to do. We are all doing this in our free time without compensation. So, we do what we can. We contributed to the Levelling Up inquiry, which, they pretty much ignored us. I think it's fair to say they did publish our written testimony, but that was about the end of it. Obviously, we were behind the whole vote to no confidence in the Law Society, which, as you've just alluded to, was ultimately unsuccessful. There's all sorts going on. Some things I lose track of what I am and I'm not allowed to talk to sometimes, because there's a lot of conversations that I have that are sort of off record or I'm not allowed to talk about. But we're very active. Over the last few months, we've been less so, and I think it's fair to say we were little bit deflated after we lost the vote to no confidence, deflated and exhausted, because this was taking up a lot of our time. So, we do what we can, bearing in mind that we're limited by resources, members, and just free time in general. But we try and do what we can, and a lot of it is obviously about just spreading awareness through social media and what have you. But there's going to be a lot more coming, hopefully, this year. I think we're still sort of debating what our main focus for this year is going to be, but material information definitely is not dead. That's going to be, well, I wish material information were dead, but I meant
that it were. But
yeah. Well, I misspoke there. I certainly hope that it will be dead, but I mean that the discussion and our activities surrounding fighting material information are not over. That will be an ongoing conversation. And the fifth edition is still not dead, although you'd be forgiven for thinking it is. So there's still work to do. So watch this space.
I think it's interesting though, Colin, because you've just said, oh, you were deflated because the vote of no confidence was unsuccessful. As from the outside looking in, I don't think it was, because I think without that, the Law Society wouldn't have taken time to pause. I mean, against you, we've talked about this, haven't we?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I wouldn't look at it as a negative. It was still considered, wasn't it? So to get it to that point must be some kind of achievement.
And what did you think about
Yeah,
the
well,
debate, Colin? I mean, Stephen obviously stood up. I mean, full disclosure, I did too. Not that I decided to on the day, I must say. But how do you feel it went? How do you feel it was run?
yeah, well, I stood up too in that, but the whole thing was a bit of a debacle because we had people who weren't getting their applications to attend dealt with in a timely manner, or some of them were refused. So we had a lot of confusion going on there. And then when we showed up on the day, we were all told that, well, we were told in advance that we were given 5 minutes, and they said, actually, we've reduced it to 3 minutes. So we all had to hurriedly rewrite our speeches, those of us that had pre-prepared them, and we're just shooting from the hip. So the whole thing was a bit sort of chaotic. I think you're quite right to revisit the points about feeling deflated. I think we weren't, well, personally at least, I wasn't deflated so much because we lost. It was because we realised sort of what we were up against in a way. I mean, I think you had to be in the room, which I was on the day, to really grasp what we were up against here, because a lot of the council members who voted didn't have a clue what they were voting for. They were there to support, in my view, this is my view, and nothing more. But having spoken to many of them, both at the event and at the pub afterwards, many of them had no idea what they were voting for and were there just to support the CEO and the president. And this is something we were warned about, that they would close ranks. They would see this as an attack on the Law Society and by outsiders. And that's not what we were hoping for. We were hoping that our argument would be assessed on the value, on the merits of what we were saying, rather naively. rather than it being a case of us versus them. And I think I personally realised that politics is a bit of a dirty business, and was somewhat disappointed by the Law Society closing ranks in the way that it did, with the notable exception of the one councilman, by the way, that joined us and kindly gave a speech in support. But no, you're quite right. I think maybe I'm a bit too harsh on ourselves, and we did accomplish a great deal. But still, and also, to be frank, I think we could have done better on the day with our speeches. We could have perhaps, um, prepared better. We could have aligned our speeches a bit better. But we were up against so much. None of us are, as far as I know, were experienced public speakers or experienced debaters or anything of the sort. So, we were up against a great deal and we accomplished a great deal, but just didn't go our way, unfortunately.
Well, I am an experienced public speaker and I still found it quite challenging. As I only decided on the day to pick up on 2 or 3 threads, but it's a minor but dull point, Colin. But they said, you've got 3 minutes from when you introduce yourself. Introduce yourself when your 3 minutes start, and you've realised you've taken 30 seconds to say who you are, and lo and behold, your 3 minutes had started when you opened your mouth. It's a tiny point, but anyway. So Stu, come on, you mentioned the prop tech word. You mentioned it, or words, before we came on air.
Yeah, well, another contentious, 2 words, I suppose, is prop tech, and I've sort of long held the view that prop tech's kind of been thrust upon the profession. I'm not sure everybody wants prop tech. I'm not sure how many clients want prop tech. But it does seem to be now that a lot of the conferences you go on, it's dominated by tech everywhere we go. So it'd be interesting to hear your views, Colin, on prop tech and the way the profession seems to be adopting it.
Yeah, well, how many hours have we got for a discussion about prop tech? Crikey. Well, for me,
a dirty word.
yeah, well, no, not so much that. I mean, for me personally, I think it should be a choice for firms as to how tech reliant they want to be. Obviously, that should be a personal choice between firms. I think the problem when it comes to prop tech is nowadays how much influence they have over the way that we do things.
Yeah.
So and this comes back to the whole political thing. You find the Law Society being sponsored by prop tech, which to me should not be allowed. That it's a conflict of interest between the best interests of the members and their sponsors should not be allowed. It's unconscionable. And to put my tinfoil hat on for a moment, you find a lot of decisions being made by the likes of the Law Society that cannot possibly be explained by any other way than favouring their sponsors. To be quite frankly,
Like what, Colin? Let me challenge you on that. Like what?
Well, I have to be careful because
I
some of
agree.
these people are litigious. But you see, for example, that certain, the climate thing is a good example because in my experience, your mileage may differ, but I've not had a single client ask me in 11, 12 odd years of conveyancing, what's the climate risk for this property? Do I need to be concerned about climate? Maybe they are concerned, but they don't want to ask me. A lot of people who are buying properties will already be familiar with the area. Flooding is obviously the big one, but in terms of anything other than that, clients generally don't care, and they certainly don't want their transaction to be delayed as a result of anything like this. But we're now being told that it's advised to give, or not oversimplifying things perhaps here, but we now have an obligation to give advice on climate issues, or at least to limit our retainers to say that we're not giving climate advice. The whole thing's sort of ridiculous from my perspective. It's a clear expansion of the remit of the conveyancer, and I don't see why the Law Society. There's no reason, in my view, why the Law Society would not only not be fighting it, but also be issuing guidance to our members, doubling down on our commitments, alleged commitments, to be giving climate advice, unless there was a degree of deference to people other than their membership, shall we say.
Well, the lenders would be another classic example, wouldn't they? I mean, didn't one prominent lenders representative say a few years ago that effectively conveyancers underwrote the lending, the lending profession, and this, and I mean, I've noticed it because I've been doing this for a really long time, Colin, as has Stu, obviously not as long as me, but it's just the constant sort of pushing of the envelope in terms of responsibility imposed on conveyancers. You know, I say to people, do I know about windows? No, I'm not a window installer. Do I know about electrics? No, I'm not an electrician. Do I know about climate change? No, I'm not a climate change specialist. And the list goes on. And Stu, again, we talk about this quite a lot, don't we? And you can't do a chat, Stu, without mentioning professional indemnity insurance, can you?
No, well, I totally agree, Colin. And for me, yeah, you do have to evaluate. And we said earlier, didn't we, about conveyancers being consulted to things. You know, what do people actually ask clients what they want? Because in my experience, most of the property information form, when it's new format, a client's not interested in. You know, we should be doing things for the benefit of the client. If we're looking to change the process, it should be what's more beneficial to the client. And I hasten to agree. I'm not quite sure what client is going to ask us lawyers about the climate implications on a property they're buying. I really don't get it. And again, I hasten to agree that I think as a profession, we have sat back and we've allowed our sort of remit to completely change. And now there's this creep of potentially what would be a surveyor's role or condition of property enter into the conveyancing sphere. And it can only be because we have insurance. You know, there's no reason why we should be doing, we shouldn't really be incompetent on flooding, let alone anything else. You could argue, stamp duty, that how complex that's now got. That's a tax. Should we be advising on tax? Obviously not. So it goes on and on, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is one of my favorite statistics. Ricks say that 1 in 4 people, buyers, make the decision to have a survey in addition to the lender's survey. So if they have a choice, only 1 in 4 buyers decide to have a survey. So that goes to show what the average buyer in their mind, how they value information about the condition of the property compared to the cost of obtaining that information. It's relevant for material information generally because it shows that despite what a lot of the proponents of material information are saying, not to go back to that previous point, but how long it will take, how much will it cost? Those are the 2 most important things for virtually every buyer. And everything else, in my experience, in general, is way down the list. Obviously, every buyer is different, every client is different. But in general terms, those are the 2 most important things. And more information, more obligations on the conveyancer is just going to increase either how long it takes or how much it'll cost or both. And that's a disservice to the majority of buyers. And I think this broad brush approach of all buyers must be provided with this information, that information, etc., is the wrong approach. I think everything should be tailored to the extent that the conveyancer is allowed to. Obviously, you've got obligations to your lenders and so forth and so on. But the way to deal with things more efficiently and in the best interest of the majority of buyers is to do the level of due diligence that the conveyancer thinks is appropriate and that the buyer / lender wants, rather than taking this broad brush approach that's going to slow everything down and make everything more expensive.
Well, and push a whole bunch of conveyancers out of the profession because the job just becomes too unpleasant and too stressful, which of course we've seen happening over the last 2 or 3 years, which of course just exacerbates the problem in terms of delay and stress and everything else because you don't have the pool of people left to push the work through. I mean, I find the whole thing completely extraordinary, I have to say. So Colin, your spicy LinkedIn posts, you said you'd taken a bit of a productivity break. So I think what we all want to know, don't we, Stu? Because Stu and I very often send your posts to each other and say, oh my word, look what Colin's written now. And I wish we were that brave. So Colin, are you flooding back to LinkedIn? Do tell us.
Yeah, I'm back on LinkedIn now. I tend to do these things in waves as and when the sort of inspiration strikes me. But ever since I made the jump to consultancy, I find that I've got less free time to be doing these things because it's being self-employed. It's no longer a 9 to 5, is it? It's a full-time thing. So as and when the inspiration strikes me, I may make more spicy, to use your word, posts in the future. But the inspiration has to strike me first. So we'll see.
So what would you say, to the extent that you can, because I realise it's only very early in the year and you've already said you're having lots of different sort of conversations, in and out of the public domain, Colin. So perhaps to conclude, because we could talk to you for days, what message do you want to get across to conveyancers about the Property Lawyers Alliance in particular?
Join us if you want to. If you agree that conveyancers need to band together. because conveyancers, I think, are lacking in representation. The Law Society is not going to represent you. I mean, I think everybody more or less accepts that the Law Society never didn't really, in any meaningful way, represent conveyancers' best interests. But we made the transition last year to not representing our best interests, to acting against our best interests and actively fighting against us. So the Law Society is not going to represent you. As far as I know, there are no other groups that are membership groups that really care about what you have to say and your experiences and what you want to achieve. There's no other group, as far as I know, that's going to represent you as well as the Property Lawyers Alliance. We're all of us practicing conveyancers. We know what it's like. We're going through the exact same things that you are. So if you see eye to eye with us, and not everybody does, obviously, we can't be out there with our heads above the parapet and have everybody agree with absolutely everything. But if you agree that conveyancers need to be better represented, perhaps need to fight back against certain things, some of which we've discussed, then join us.
Yeah, well, it was the head above the parapet thing. That was the very phrase you used, wasn't it, Stu?
Absolutely, yeah. I think people shouldn't underestimate how difficult that is, and like you've already alluded to, the time it must take whilst working as well. I take my hat off to you how you managed to fit it all in.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons that I ended up making the jump to consultancy was because I was getting so many complaints to my employer at my previous firm about the stuff that I was putting on LinkedIn that it led to many awkward conversations. I just thought, you know what, I'm going to make the jump to consultancy, so that I don't have to worry as much about having to have awkward conversations with my 70-odd-year-old boss at the time who had to explain to him what a meme was.
But that's really interesting, Colin, having just said let's close the conversation, because funnily enough, Stu and I actually, didn't we? We made that very comment to each other off air. We said, God, does this cause Colin a bit of issue in the in the employment context? And evidently it has. But I think what's extraordinary actually is the fact that you feel strongly enough to sort of put your money where your mouth is, quite literally.
Yeah, I've never been one to shy away from a fight, even if it's advisable to do so, which I think it probably is. But I think the reason why, not to get too soppy here, but I think the reason why many of us sort of gravitated towards a career in the law is because we believe in what's right and justice and all of that sort of stuff. So, I believe in speaking up for what's right and what's in the best interests of our clients and all that sort of good stuff. So it rubs a lot of people the wrong way that I make fun of them, because some people don't have a sense of humor. But I think it needs to be done. I don't take myself too seriously, so I like to think that some people should be able to handle a bit of banter, but not everybody can.
I think that's a fair comment. We've also mentioned that, haven't we, Stu?
Absolutely.
Yeah, sense of humour failures.
Yeah,
Well,
definitely.
Colin, thanks so much for joining us. Really, really interesting chat. Really insightful. And well, I'm going to immediately throw down the gauntlet and say, will you join us again at some point?
If you want me to, absolutely. If you don't get cancelled as a result of my appearance, I'd be more than happy to have you to be back anytime.
Yeah. We'd love to see you again later on in the year. And maybe at that point we can focus on some of the key issues that have come up.
Yeah, well, to leave your guests with a bit of a teaser, I'm hoping that we'll have some big, 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 big news soon. But I've been saying that for the past year, so that probably teases your guests with a bit of a impression as to how important this is. That we've been waiting for this for a year or so, but something big hopefully is coming in the next few months at least. So watch this space.
Oh, excellent. Well, thanks for joining us, Colin.
Pleasure.
Take care.
Okay, guys,
Bye.
yeah.